The morning sun cast long shadows across Battery Park as Detective James Monk adjusted his worn leather jacket and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 45 years old, Monk had spent the better part of 2 decades working the streets of Manhattan, and his weathered face told the story of countless late nights, difficult cases, and the kind of moral compromises that came with police work in a city as complex as New York. His reputation within the NYPD was built on patience, attention to detail, and an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns that other investigators missed, qualities that had made him one of the most respected detectives in the department, despite his tendency to work alone and his reluctance to engage in the political games that often determined career advancement. The early October morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of visibility that made the Statue of Liberty appear deceptively close across New York Harbor, and Monk found himself reflecting on how many times he had made this same journey over the years, sometimes for work, sometimes simply to clear his head when a case became too complicated or personal. Today's trip was different, though he couldn't quite articulate why the routine surveillance assignment felt charged with tension that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air or the anticipation of another day spent watching and waiting for something that might never happen. Detective Sarah Martinez walked across the park toward the ferry terminal, her dark hair pulled back in the practical ponytail that had become her signature look during her 8 years as Monk's partner in the NYPD's major case squad, and at 36 years old, she had already established herself as one of the department's rising stars, with a combination of street smarts and academic credentials that complemented Monk's analytical approach perfectly. The Statue of Liberty ferry terminal bustled with its usual mix of tourists, local commuters, and the occasional law enforcement personnel who used the ferry service for various official purposes. Monk had positioned himself near the ticket booth, ostensibly reading a newspaper, while actually observing the steady stream of passengers who were boarding the morning ferry to Liberty Island. According to their briefing, they were looking for a city planning official named Robert Chen, who had been suspected of accepting bribes in exchange for expediting construction permits for luxury development projects throughout Manhattan, and Chen's pattern suggested that he conducted many of his illicit meetings on the ferry or on Liberty Island itself, apparently believing that the tourist environment made it an ideal location for conducting business that required discretion. Martinez approached Monk's position near the terminal entrance, maintaining the casual demeanor that they had perfected during hundreds of similar operations over the years, and their ability to work together without obvious communication had become legendary within the department. Today, however, Martinez noticed something different in Monk's posture and facial expression, a tension that seemed more personal than professional, and that made her wonder if there were aspects of this assignment that she hadn't been told about. She had learned to trust Monk's instincts completely during their years of partnership, but she had also learned to recognize the signs that indicated when he was holding back information or pursuing leads that he considered too sensitive or dangerous to share immediately. The Chen surveillance case had always felt incomplete to Martinez, with gaps in the case file and inconsistencies in the timeline that suggested there might be additional targets or a larger conspiracy than their official briefing had indicated. As passengers began boarding the ferry, Monk positioned himself in the security line in a way that would allow him to observe both a woman he had noticed and any other individuals who might match their surveillance targets. The woman who had caught Monk's attention moved through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled frequently, but she also seemed to be observing the screening process itself in a way that suggested professional rather than personal interest. Martinez observed Monk's boarding process from her position in a different security line, noting that he seemed more focused than usual and that he appeared to be paying particular attention to a woman who didn't match any of their known surveillance targets. Once aboard the ferry, Monk chose a seat near the stern that provided good visibility of both the passenger area and the approach to Liberty Island, while also positioning himself where he could observe the woman who had caught his attention without appearing to be watching her specifically. The woman appeared to be traveling alone and conducting her own observation activities, which could indicate either legitimate tourism or some kind of intelligence gathering that might be relevant to their investigation. As the ferry departed from Battery Park and began its journey across New York Harbor, Monk initiated his standard surveillance routine of observing passenger behavior, documenting interactions, and looking for any signs of the criminal activity that their investigation was designed to detect and prevent. However, He found himself repeatedly drawn to observing the woman who had caught his attention during boarding, partly because her behavior continued to suggest professional surveillance activities, and partly because he was beginning to recognize something familiar about her appearance that he couldn't quite identify. Approximately 15 minutes into the ferry journey, as Liberty Island began to dominate the view ahead, and most passengers had moved to the outdoor decks for better photo opportunities, Monk noticed that the woman he had been observing seemed to be preparing to approach him directly. She had been gradually moving through the passenger area in a way that appeared casual, but that brought her progressively closer to his position, and she was now within normal conversation distance while maintaining the pretense of looking out the windows at the approaching landmark. The woman approached Monk with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations, and when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement training combined with an undertone of urgency that immediately captured his full attention. "Detective Monk," she said, using his name and title in a way that confirmed she knew exactly who he was and why he was on the ferry. "My name is Agent Victoria Kane, and I need to speak with you about your current investigation." Her appearance was professional but not obviously governmental, and her credentials, when she displayed them discreetly, identified her as a federal agent with an agency that Monk didn't immediately recognize, but that appeared legitimate, based on the quality of the documentation and the specific security features that he had learned to identify during his years of police work. Agent Kane's approach and identification created an immediate shift in the dynamics of Monk's surveillance operation, transforming what had appeared to be routine local police work into something that apparently involved federal law enforcement and potentially national security considerations. Agent Kane suggested that they move to a more private area of the ferry, where they could speak without being overheard by other passengers, and Monk found himself following her toward a section of the indoor passenger area that was less crowded and offered better acoustics for confidential conversation. Once they had moved to the more secluded area of the passenger compartment, Agent Kane's demeanor became noticeably more serious, and her voice dropped to the kind of confidential tone that Monk associated with discussions of highly sensitive law enforcement matters. "Detective, the investigation you're conducting into Robert Chen has uncovered activities that go far beyond municipal corruption," she began, her words carrying implications that immediately expanded Monk's understanding of why federal agencies might be involved in what had appeared to be a straightforward local case. "Chen is a mid-level player in a network that includes foreign intelligence operations, money laundering through construction projects, and what we believe might be plans for activities targeting landmark locations throughout New York City. The revelation that their surveillance target was potentially involved in serious crimes rather than simple bribery represented a fundamental shift in the nature and stakes of their investigation, and Monk found himself rapidly recalculating the risks and implications of their current operation. Agent Kane continued, "What we need from you is to continue your surveillance as planned, but to document everything you observe and to be prepared to act as a witness in federal proceedings that will likely begin within the next several weeks. The timing of today's operation is critical because we believe Chen is meeting with his handler today, and this may be our only opportunity to observe and document their interaction before the network realizes that they're under investigation." The ferry was now approaching Liberty Island, and Agent Kane explained that Chen's meeting was scheduled to take place somewhere on the island itself, probably near one of the less crowded areas where conversation could occur without being overheard by tourists or security personnel. She provided Monk with a small communications device that would allow him to maintain contact with federal agents who were already positioned on the island, and she emphasized that his role was to observe and document rather than to intervene, even if the conversations he overheard suggested immediate activity. As the ferry docked at Liberty Island and passengers began disembarking, Monk found himself torn between his official assignment to continue surveillance of Robert Chen and his growing concern about Agent Kane's identity and the legitimacy of the federal operation she claimed to represent. While her credentials had appeared authentic and her knowledge of the case details suggested legitimate federal involvement, something about her approach and the information she had shared felt inconsistent with standard federal law enforcement procedures that Monk had encountered during his years of police work. Federal agents typically coordinated with local law enforcement through official channels and supervisory structures rather than through direct contact during active operations, and Kane's decision to approach him directly on the ferry suggested either unusual urgency or some kind of operational improvisation that might not have been approved through normal federal channels. Martinez had observed Monk's conversation with the unidentified woman from her position on the observation deck, noting that their interaction had appeared serious and confidential, but that Monk's body language didn't suggest any immediate danger or threat. On Liberty Island, the usual crowds of tourists created both opportunities and challenges for surveillance activities, as the large numbers of people provided cover for observers, but also made it more difficult to maintain visual and audio contact with specific targets. Approximately 30 minutes after disembarking from the ferry, Monk identified Robert Chen among a group of visitors who were walking toward one of the less crowded areas of the island, accompanied by two other individuals who matched descriptions from federal surveillance files that Kane had referenced during their conversation. Chen appeared to be conducting normal tourist activities, taking photographs and reading informational displays, but his movement pattern suggested that he was gradually working his way toward a predetermined location where a meeting could occur without attracting attention from other visitors or security personnel. The meeting that Monk observed between Chen and his companions lasted approximately 20 minutes and included the exchange of documents and what appeared to be detailed planning discussions about construction projects and permit processes throughout Manhattan. However, the content of their conversation seemed to focus on legitimate business activities rather than the serious planning that Agent Kane had suggested was the real purpose of Chen's activities. Monk found himself questioning whether Kane might have provided inaccurate information about the nature of Chen's involvement in federal crimes, or whether the meeting he was observing might be a preliminary discussion that would be followed by more sensitive planning sessions at a different time or location. After documenting Chen's meeting and the departure of his companions, Monk attempted to re-establish contact with Agent Kane using the communications device she had provided, but he received no response despite multiple attempts to reach her on various channels. The communications device appeared to be functional, but either Kane was not monitoring it or the equipment was not connected to the federal communication networks that she had claimed it would access. As the afternoon progressed and visitors began returning to the ferry for the journey back to Battery Park, Monk searched the crowds for any sign of Agent Kane, but was unable to locate her among the passengers who were boarding the return ferry. During the return ferry journey to Battery Park, Monk found himself reflecting on the unusual events of the day and trying to understand what had actually occurred during what had appeared to be a routine surveillance assignment. As the ferry approached Battery Park and Manhattan's skyline grew larger ahead of them, Monk made the decision to document everything that had occurred during the day's operation and to report the unusual contact with Agent Kane through official NYPD channels before taking any further action based on the information she had provided. However, as Monk prepared to disembark from the ferry, he discovered a handwritten note that had been placed in his jacket pocket at some point during the day's activities, apparently without his knowledge or awareness of when or how it had been placed there. The note was written on plain paper in block letters that provided no obvious indication of the author's identity, and it contained only 4 words, "Don't trust her," followed by what appeared to be initials or a code that Monk didn't recognize. The discovery of the note created immediate concern about his personal safety and the security of the investigation, as it suggested that someone with access to his physical proximity had information about Agent Kane or other aspects of the case that they considered important enough to communicate through clandestine means. The cryptic warning contained in the note seemed to confirm Monk's growing suspicions about Agent Kane's identity and the legitimacy of the federal operation she had described, but it also raised new questions about who might have provided the warning and what specific information they possessed about Kane or the broader investigation. As Monk and Martinez left the ferry terminal and prepared to return to their vehicle for the drive back to NYPD headquarters, Monk made the decision to share the mysterious note with his partner, while also briefing her on the details of his conversation with Agent Kane and the unusual events that had occurred during the surveillance operation. However, as they approached their unmarked police vehicle in the Battery Park parking area, both detectives noticed signs that the car had been accessed or searched during their absence, including subtle changes in the position of items they had left in specific locations and evidence of tampering with the vehicle's locks and electronic systems. The apparent search of their official vehicle represented a serious escalation in the complexity and potential danger of their situation, suggesting that their surveillance activities had been observed by unknown parties who had both the motivation and the capability to conduct counter-surveillance operations against law enforcement personnel. Technical specialists who examined Monk and Martinez's vehicle discovered evidence of sophisticated surveillance equipment installation, including GPS tracking devices and audio monitoring systems that were more advanced than typical surveillance technology, and that suggested either federal agency involvement or access to federal-level surveillance equipment through other means. Based on the evidence they had gathered throughout the day, including Agent Kane's suspicious behavior, the anonymous warning note, and the discovery of unauthorized surveillance equipment in their vehicle, Monk and Martinez requested immediate meetings with their supervisors and with federal liaison officers to verify the legitimacy of any federal operations that might be connected to their Chen surveillance case. The meetings with supervisory personnel revealed that no federal agencies had requested coordination or assistance with investigations related to Robert Chen, and that no legitimate federal operations were known to be active in connection with the corruption case that had been assigned to Monk and Martinez. Investigation into Agent Kane's identity revealed that the credentials she had shown to Monk were sophisticated forgeries that would have been difficult to detect during a brief examination, but that contained subtle flaws that indicated they had not been produced through official federal channels. Over the following weeks, attempts to identify and locate the individual who had posed as Agent Kane proved unsuccessful despite extensive investigation by both NYPD and federal counterintelligence specialists. 3 months after the Liberty Island incident, Monk began receiving anonymous messages that seemed to be related to the Kane investigation, including photographs of individuals who appeared to be conducting surveillance on his personal activities and information about his family members that could only have been obtained through extensive research or investigation. As the threats and surveillance activities continued to escalate, Monk made the difficult decision to request reassignment to cases that were less likely to attract attention from whatever organization had been behind the Kane operation. But he found that the sense of being watched and targeted persisted regardless of his official assignments. The final entry in Detective James Monk's official case files, dated 12 years ago, referenced his intention to conduct one additional investigation into the Kane incident using unofficial methods and resources that would not expose other NYPD personnel to whatever dangers he had encountered. The file contained references to contacts he planned to make with federal agencies and private investigators who might have access to information that had not been available through official channels, but it provided no details about the specific approaches he intended to use or the timeline for such activities. The last known communication from Monk was a brief note to Martinez stating that he was following a lead that might finally provide answers about the Kane operation, but that he would not be able to maintain contact until the investigation was complete. On the day of his disappearance, security cameras at the Statue of Liberty ferry terminal captured Monk boarding the morning ferry alone, carrying a small briefcase and appearing to be conducting routine surveillance activities similar to those from his original Chen assignment. However, when the ferry returned to Battery Park that evening, Monk was nowhere to be found among the disembarking passengers, and his briefcase was discovered on his seat, containing only personal items and the mysterious handwritten note warning, "Don't trust her." Ferry personnel reported that they had not noticed anything unusual during the day's operations, and passenger manifests showed no record of anyone matching Agent Kane's description or any other individuals who might have been connected to Monk's investigation. The mysterious note found in Monk's seat became the only concrete evidence of his final investigation and the circumstances that led to his disappearance, and despite extensive searches and investigations by both NYPD and federal agencies, no trace of Detective James Monk was ever found. The case became one of the NYPD's most troubling unsolved mysteries, representing not only the loss of an exceptional detective, but also the implications of unknown intelligence operations that apparently had the capability to target and eliminate law enforcement personnel who posed threats to their activities. Detective Martinez continued to investigate Monk's disappearance for several years, following every possible lead and coordinating with federal agencies to try to understand what had happened to her partner and whether the threats he had faced might extend to other law enforcement personnel. Her investigation revealed patterns of similar incidents involving local police officers who had encountered individuals claiming to be federal agents. But in each case, the supposed federal operations proved to be illegitimate, and the officers involved had either disappeared or suffered mysterious accidents that prevented them from continuing their investigations. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to monitor and neutralize law enforcement personnel who might stumble upon certain types of criminal activities, but the sophistication of the operations made it nearly impossible to identify the organization or individuals responsible for such activities. Martinez eventually established a network of law enforcement professionals who shared information about suspicious federal contacts and unexplained surveillance activities, creating an informal system for detecting and reporting potential threats before they could escalate to the level that Monk had experienced. 12 years after Monk's disappearance, new evidence surfaced when a former federal agent came forward with information about a rogue intelligence operation that had been conducting unauthorized surveillance and elimination activities targeting local law enforcement personnel who had inadvertently discovered evidence of foreign intelligence networks operating within the United States. The revelation that Monk had likely been targeted by a domestic intelligence operation designed to protect foreign agents operating in New York provided the first credible explanation for his disappearance and the sophisticated surveillance activities that had preceded it. However, the statute of limitations and the classified nature of the intelligence operations made it unlikely that anyone would ever be prosecuted for Monk's disappearance or the threats against other law enforcement personnel. Martinez, now a lieutenant with the NYPD, continues to maintain Monk's case file as an active investigation, hoping that additional evidence will eventually surface that could provide definitive answers about what happened to one of the department's most dedicated and capable detectives. The legacy of Detective James Monk's disappearance has become a cautionary tale within law enforcement communities about the dangers of investigating cases that might involve intelligence operations, and his story is used in training programs to help officers recognize and respond appropriately to suspicious federal contacts or unexplained surveillance activities. The passing months after Detective Monk's disappearance marked a period of profound uncertainty within the NYPD. Detective Sarah Martinez, now promoted to lieutenant, took the lead on efforts to keep Monk's case active despite the department's shifting focus. She maintained contact with federal agencies, private investigators, and whistleblowers, who sometimes surfaced with fragments of information pointing to a shadowy network operating beyond public oversight. Her dedication to finding answers about her former partner's fate became both a professional obsession and a personal mission that consumed much of her off-duty time. The weight of responsibility she felt for Monk's safety during that final operation never left her, creating a driving need to understand what had happened and to prevent similar incidents from occurring to other law enforcement personnel. Martinez established relationships with journalists and congressional staffers who were interested in investigating potential abuses of federal power, hoping that increased public attention might force disclosure of classified information related to Monk's disappearance. Her efforts gradually revealed that Monk's case was not isolated, but part of a broader pattern of law enforcement personnel who had encountered suspicious federal contacts and subsequently experienced threats or unexplained disappearances. Though the trail mostly ended in obscurity, Martinez refused to accept that Monk's disappearance was in vain. She assembled a confidential network of like-minded officers and investigators dedicated to exposing unauthorized intelligence operations interfering with law enforcement. Their work became known within inner circles as the Monk Initiative, a quiet but determined effort to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The initiative developed protocols for recognizing and reporting suspicious federal contacts, created secure communication networks for sharing information about potential threats, and established connections with legal advocacy organizations that could provide protection for officers who found themselves targeted by unknown intelligence operations. Martinez recruited participants from multiple law enforcement agencies using encrypted communications and compartmentalized information sharing to protect participants from surveillance and targeting. Over time, the initiative documented dozens of cases involving suspicious federal contacts and unauthorized surveillance of law enforcement personnel, creating a comprehensive database of evidence that suggested systematic abuse of intelligence capabilities. The growing body of evidence strengthened Martinez's conviction that Monk had been targeted by a sophisticated domestic intelligence operation that posed ongoing threats to law enforcement integrity and officer safety throughout the country. Across the city, Monk's image became a symbol of unresolved sacrifice and the dangers faced by those who pushed too close to invisible threats. Training programs began incorporating lessons from Monk's disappearance, teaching officers how to recognize potential intelligence operations and protect themselves when investigating cases that might attract unwanted federal attention. The NYPD established new protocols for verifying the identity and authority of federal agents who made contact with local officers during investigations, requiring documentation and supervisory notification that would make it more difficult for unauthorized individuals to approach officers without detection. Local media coverage of memorial events gradually increased public awareness of Monk's disappearance and the broader issues of accountability and transparency in federal law enforcement activities, generating political pressure for congressional oversight and investigation of domestic intelligence operations. With time, Martinez herself grew more convinced that the rogue operations were enabled by deep systemic failures, where jurisdictional boundaries and fragmented oversight allowed shadowy actors to manipulate enforcement agencies. Her advocacy work brought her into contact with congressional staffers, civil liberties organizations, and journalists investigating similar patterns of abuse within federal agencies, creating a broader coalition committed to exposing and preventing unauthorized intelligence operations. On a cold autumn evening, 12 years after Monk vanished, an anonymous package arrived at NYPD headquarters containing a data drive encrypted with sophisticated security measures. Martinez led the decryption effort, revealing files that included previously undisclosed communications, surveillance logs, and partial audio recordings related to the clandestine activities Monk had uncovered. The material shed new light on the intricate network of false identities, covert surveillance, and intelligence leaks that had surrounded his final investigation. Among the most significant revelations were communication logs that showed coordination between the individual who had posed as Agent Kane and several other operatives who had conducted similar operations in other cities, indicating that Monk's case was part of a much larger program targeting law enforcement investigations throughout the country. The files also contained partial surveillance recordings of Monk's final investigation, including audio from the ferry and Liberty Island, that provided new insights into the events leading up to his disappearance. Though the files were incomplete, they reignited hope that sufficient evidence existed to officially reopen Monk's case at multiple jurisdictional levels. Martinez vowed to continue pursuing every lead, honoring Monk's dedication and refusing to let the mystery fade into oblivion. The legacy of Detective James Monk continues to resonate within the halls of justice, serving as a potent reminder of the sacrifices demanded by the quest for truth in the face of invisible adversaries. Training programs at police academies across the country now include modules based on Monk's case, teaching new officers about proper procedures when encountering federal contacts. The Monk Initiative evolved into a formal organization, providing resources and support for law enforcement personnel who encounter suspicious federal operations. Congressional legislation inspired by Monk's disappearance has created new requirements for federal agencies to report and coordinate their interactions with local law enforcement, reducing opportunities for rogue operatives to conduct unauthorized activities. Through all of these developments, the memory of Detective James Monk serves as both inspiration and warning, reminding current and future law enforcement personnel that the pursuit of justice sometimes requires confronting powerful adversaries, but that such confrontations can be managed more safely through proper preparation, institutional support, and collective action that honors the sacrifices of those who came before.